In the final months of the 20th century, deep in the green hills of southwestern Uganda, hundreds of people stopped speaking, not metaphorically, literally. Inside a secluded religious movement called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, followers believed unnecessary speech was sinful. Conversation became restricted. Members communicated through whispers, gestures, or handwritten notes. Silence was treated as purification. Every careless word, leaders warned, pushed humanity further toward damnation. To outsiders, it looked bizarre. To followers, it felt necessary. Because according to the movement's leaders, the end of the world was approaching rapidly, and God was already separating the worthy from the condemned. The Virgin Mary herself, they claimed, had delivered the warning. And soon, nearly 800 people would be dead. Some burned alive inside a locked church, others poisoned, others strangled, others buried in secret graves before the fire had even begun. At first, international headlines described it as a mass suicide, but investigators who entered the ruins found something far more disturbing. Evidence of planning, evidence of concealment, evidence that many victims may never have intended to die at all. And perhaps the most chilling possibility of all, the leaders responsible may have escaped. The story of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God does not begin with fire. It begins with fear. To understand why this movement gained followers, you have to understand Uganda in the 1980s and 1990s. The country had endured years of violence, dictatorship, economic collapse, and civil conflict. The regime of Idi Amin left psychological scars across the nation. Political instability continued afterward. Entire communities had lived through massacres, disappearances, and displacement. At the same time, the AIDS epidemic devastated families across East Africa, creating enormous grief and uncertainty. For many Ugandans, the future felt unstable and frightening. And when societies experience prolonged instability, apocalyptic movements often emerge. Because apocalypse offers something strangely comforting: certainty. It transforms chaos into narrative. Suffering becomes meaningful, tragedy becomes prophecy, and fear becomes proof that the believers were right all along. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God emerged directly from that atmosphere. The group formed in the late 1980s around a cluster of self-proclaimed visionaries who claimed to receive divine messages through visions and apparitions. The movement blended strict Catholic imagery with apocalyptic prophecy, emphasizing repentance, judgment, and purification. Among its central leaders was Joseph Kibwetere, a former local politician and respected businessman. By most accounts, Kibwetere initially appeared deeply ordinary. He had worked in public administration. He was educated, socially connected, and active in religious life. But sometime during the 1980s, he became increasingly convinced that supernatural revelations were guiding him toward a divine mission. Another major figure was Credonia Morinde, a woman who reportedly claimed to receive direct visions from the Virgin Mary. Former followers later described her as emotionally intense, manipulative, and deeply influential within the movement's hierarchy. Unlike Kibwetere, who projected calm authority, Morinde reportedly ruled through fear, guilt, and spiritual intimidation. Together, the leadership developed a worldview centered around one terrifying premise: humanity had become irredeemably corrupt. The Ten Commandments, they argued, were no longer being followed. Society was spiritually diseased. Sexual immorality, dishonesty, greed, modern culture, and political corruption were portrayed as evidence that humanity was approaching divine judgment. The movement taught that the apocalypse was not theoretical. It had already begun. At first, the group attracted followers through prayer meetings and religious gatherings. Its message resonated with people already immersed in Catholic spirituality, but frustrated with institutional religion. The leaders presented themselves not as rebels against Christianity, but as restorers of true Christianity. That distinction mattered. The movement framed itself as purification, not innovation. Followers were told they were part of a chosen remnant preparing for the final days before God's intervention. Salvation required obedience, sacrifice, and separation from worldly corruption. As membership expanded, the group established compounds in rural Uganda, including a large property in Kanungu that would eventually become synonymous with catastrophe. Life inside these compounds became increasingly controlled. Members prayed for long hours every day. Fasting was common, confession rituals intensified, rules multiplied, leaders monitored behavior constantly. Former followers later described a climate of fear disguised as devotion. One of the movement's most unusual practices involved silence. The group reportedly taught that idle speech encouraged sin and deception. Over time, members became discouraged from casual conversation altogether. Communication narrowed. Social bonds weakened outside the movement's authority structure. This had a powerful psychological effect. Silence reduces dissent. It limits spontaneous emotional connection. It prevents followers from processing doubts collectively. And it increases dependence on leadership interpretation. Inside isolated systems, control does not always require violence. Sometimes it requires simply preventing people from talking long enough to question what they already know. Children were raised inside the movement. Entire families surrendered their savings and property to the organization. Communal labor became routine. Followers farmed land, cooked meals, cleaned compounds, and attended endless religious instruction. Meanwhile, the prophecies became more specific. Throughout the 1990s, leaders repeatedly warned that the world would soon end in divine destruction. Eventually, they announced an exact date, January 1st, 2000. The timing could not have been more psychologically effective. Across the world, the approaching millennium already carried enormous symbolic anxiety. Fears about biblical prophecy, technological collapse, and global catastrophe spread far beyond extremist movements. Even mainstream society was saturated with millennial tension. The cult absorbed that fear and amplified it. Followers prepared intensely. Many sold their homes, businesses, and livestock. Others gave away possessions entirely. The logic was simple. Earthly wealth would soon become meaningless. Some members reportedly stopped planning for the future altogether. Why prepare for next year if history itself was about to end? The movement's compounds became increasingly isolated. Members spent more time praying, fasting, and awaiting judgment. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Doubt became spiritually dangerous. Inside the movement, certainty hardened into totalism. And then the prophecy failed. January 1st, 2000 arrived. Nothing happened. The world continued. No apocalypse, no divine destruction, no ascension. For apocalyptic movements, failed prophecy creates a uniquely dangerous moment. Because once followers sacrifice everything for a prediction, leadership credibility becomes fragile. Members begin asking questions. Financial tensions rise. Some demand explanations. Former members later reported exactly this kind of panic unfolding inside the movement after January 1st passed uneventfully. Followers who had surrendered land and money allegedly demanded answers. Some reportedly asked for their property back. And that represented a serious threat, not just financially, psychologically. Because if members openly acknowledged the prophecy had failed, the authority structure itself could collapse. The leaders responded by reframing the prophecy. The date, they said, had been misunderstood. The apocalypse was still coming, just later. But failed prophecy changes group psychology permanently. Once certainty fractures, leaders often escalate control dramatically to prevent disintegration. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments appears to have entered exactly that stage. In the weeks following the failed millennium prediction, reports suggest internal tension intensified. Meetings became more secretive. Rituals grew increasingly urgent. Then came March 17th, 2000. On that day, followers gathered at the Kanungu compound for what was described as a major religious celebration. Witnesses later reported hearing singing and seeing unusually large numbers of people entering the church building. To nearby villagers, it looked festive. Some followers wore their best clothing. Food had reportedly been prepared. The atmosphere appeared strangely joyful, but investigators later concluded something darker may have been happening inside. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, the church exploded into flames. The fire spread almost instantly. Witnesses described screams coming from inside the building as the blaze intensified. Some reports suggested windows had been boarded shut. Others claimed the doors were difficult or impossible to open once the fire began. The structure collapsed rapidly. Hundreds of people died inside. The images shocked the world. At first, authorities believed they were dealing with a catastrophic mass suicide tied to millennial prophecy. But as investigators began searching nearby compounds connected to the movement, the narrative changed dramatically. Bodies started appearing elsewhere. Mass graves were uncovered near cult properties, corpses hidden beneath floors, bodies buried in gardens, victims wrapped in cloth and concealed in pits. Some remains showed signs of poisoning. Others appeared strangled or hacked to death. The death toll climbed rapidly, 200, 400, 600. Eventually, investigators estimated that more than 700 people may have died in connection with the movement, and the timeline raised horrifying questions. If victims in the graves had already been murdered before the church fire, then the fire itself may not have been a collective suicide at all. It may have been the final stage of a larger operation, possibly a mass killing designed to eliminate remaining followers and destroy evidence. Investigators also noticed another disturbing detail. Some senior leaders were missing. Initially, authorities assumed figures like Joseph Kibwetera and Credonia Morinde died in the blaze, but identifying bodies proved extremely difficult due to the intensity of the fire. As the investigation continued, uncertainty grew over whether key leaders were actually among the dead. Rumors spread rapidly. Some witnesses claimed surviving leaders had been seen elsewhere after the fire. Others suggested movement funds disappeared shortly before the disaster. To this day, uncertainty remains over whether some leadership figures escaped entirely. And that possibility fundamentally changes how the tragedy is understood. Because if leaders fled before the fire, then the movement's final act was not collective martyrdom. It was extermination. The aftermath devastated Uganda. Entire communities lost relatives, children vanished, families searched for answers among burned remains and mass graves. International journalists descended on Kanungu, broadcasting images of the destroyed church across the world. But the deeper horror was psychological, because the movement did not initially look monstrous. It looked hopeful. It offered certainty during chaos, structure during instability, meaning during suffering. And that is often how these systems grow. Rarely through obvious madness, more often through emotional usefulness. The movement gave followers an explanation for why the world felt broken. It transformed uncertainty into prophecy and obedience into salvation. Once people surrendered enough, money, identity, relationships, autonomy, leaving became psychologically devastating. Because leaving would require admitting the sacrifice was meaningless. That realization can feel unbearable. So belief deepens, even when reality contradicts it, even when prophecies fail, even when fear replaces faith. And by the final months of the movement, many followers may no longer have been choosing freely between belief and skepticism at all. They may have been trapped inside a closed psychological system where obedience felt safer than doubt. That is what makes the story so disturbing, not simply the fire, not simply the bodies, but the gradual process that made catastrophe possible long before the flames ever started. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God did not appear overnight. It formed slowly, through fear, isolation, authority, failed prophecy, and escalating control. By the time the church burned in Kanungu, the movement had already crossed a threshold where leadership survival mattered more than follower survival. And the unanswered questions remain haunting. How many people inside the church truly believed they were approaching salvation? How many realized too late that something was wrong? How many victims in the graves tried to leave before the end? And perhaps most disturbingly, did some of the people responsible simply disappear into the chaos they created? Today, memorials stand where the church once stood. Grass grows over the sites where bodies were discovered. The movement itself is gone, but the conditions that created it remain painfully familiar. Social instability, distrust of institutions, economic hardship, and spiritual desperation. A charismatic group offering certainty during uncertain times, those conditions exist everywhere. And that may be the most frightening lesson of all, because the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was not simply a story about Uganda. It was a story about what can happen anywhere when fear becomes doctrine, obedience replaces skepticism, and belief becomes strong enough to survive even the collapse of reality itself. By the time the fire began in Kanungu, for hundreds trapped inside that building, the apocalypse had already arrived.